The ball rolled left. That was the whole thing. 3 millimeters of deviation across 14 inches of cold iron, a curl to the left so slight that a man watching from across the room would have missed it entirely. But Solomon did not miss it. He had been rolling cannonballs across the wet stone floor of the Etowah Ironworks for 11 months, and he knew the difference between a ball that ran true and a ball that lied to you. This one lied. He caught it at the far wall with his boot, bent down without hurrying, and turned it in his hands under the yellow light of the forge. The surface was smooth. The weight felt right, near enough to 12 pounds that a scale wouldn't argue. But something in the casting had shifted. A bubble in the iron, maybe, or a mold that had been jostled in the pour. Something so small it had no name in the foundry vocabulary. He set the ball back on the floor, gave it a gentle push, and watched it curve. He didn't say anything to the foreman. He picked up the ball and carried it to the finished pile. The Etowah Ironworks sat in the gorge of the Etowah River near Cartersville, Georgia, in a hollow that smelled perpetually of sulfur and pine resin and the sweet-sour rot of the river shallows at low water. It was September of 1862. The Confederacy had been at war for 17 months, and the foundry had been running at full production for 14 of them, turning out 12-pound solid shot, 3-inch ordnance rounds, and cast iron shells for the artillery batteries covering the approach to Atlanta from the northwest. The facility employed 31 free workers, mostly Irish and German immigrants brought south along the Western and Atlantic rail line, and an unrecorded number of enslaved men hired out from nearby plantations, listed in the foundry's account books only by first name, skill category, and weekly hire rate. Solomon appears in those books on September 3, 1862, as hand-skilled, undesignated $1.10 per week, payable to holder. He appears again on October 14th, on January 7th, 1863, and intermittently through August of that year. After August, his name stops appearing. There is no explanation for this in any record that has survived. What he knew about iron he had learned over the course of a life that no document fully describes. Based on the payroll records and a single letter from a plantation overseer dated 1859, which mentions the foundry-trained hand Solomon, steady at the pour, good eye for surface defect. Historians have placed his age somewhere between 35 and 45 at the time of the Etowah records. The letter tells us he had been working iron for at least 3 years before the war. The foundry records tell us he was assigned to the finishing station, the final hands that checked completed balls before they went into the shipment crates, which means the Confederacy trusted him to reject defective rounds. They had given him, in other words, exactly the access he needed. The flaw he found in September of 1862 was not unique. Cast iron balls occasionally developed interior voids during cooling if the mold temperature was wrong or the pour was too slow. A small pocket of gas trapped at the geometric center, invisible from outside, which shifted the ball's rotational center of mass by a fraction of a degree. On a smooth bore cannon at 400 yards, that fraction was irrelevant. At 800 yards, the operational range of the 12-pound Napoleon guns defending the Atlanta rail corridor, it meant the difference between a ball that flew true and a ball that tumbled end over end through its arc and landed 40 feet short of target, or drifted wide by 10, or struck a gun carriage at the wrong angle and bounced harmlessly into the embankment rather than shattering the wheel it was aimed at. The defect was subtle enough that it would not be detected in a visual inspection. It was subtle enough that even a competent artillerist might attribute the miss to powder variance or human error. Solomon had found it almost certainly by accident. What happened next was not an accident. He began to replicate it. The process he developed over the following 3 weeks was mechanical in the most literal sense. Adjustable, repeatable, invisible to any inspector who didn't know what he was looking for. The Etowah foundry used iron molds in 2 halves, bolted together at a center seam before the pour. The seam was the weak point. If the 2 halves were perfectly aligned and the bolts drawn to the same torque, the ball cooled evenly and ran true. But if one bolt on the upper half was drawn slightly loose, not so loose that iron leaked at the seam, just loose enough that the upper mold shifted 2 millimeters during cooling, the resulting ball would be geometrically correct on its outside surface while carrying a void 3 to 3.5 millimeters off-center in its interior. You could not see it. You could not feel it. You could only find it by rolling the finished ball across a flat, wet surface and watching which direction it drifted. He was the person checking the finished balls. He was the one who knew which ones to send forward. The question that no historian has been able to fully answer is when, exactly, Solomon made the decision. The first documented anomaly in Confederate artillery performance at Etowah-sourced munitions dates to a Union cavalry skirmish near Resaca on November 4, 1862. A Confederate battery fired 34 rounds at a dismounted column and scored 2 confirmed hits, a rate so far below expected performance for that range and target density that the Confederate artillery commander, a Major Theron Buell, filed a written complaint about powder quality with the Army of Tennessee quartermaster. Buell's complaint is preserved. It blames the powder. It does not mention the balls. By November of 1862, Solomon had been working the finishing station for 2 months. The difficulty of what he was doing cannot be overstated by stating only that it was dangerous, because dangerous is a word that belonged to free men calculating risk. For Solomon, the calculation was different. He was hired out property. If the defect was discovered and traced to the finishing station, the most charitable outcome was that he would be sold further south to a buyer who worked enslaved people in conditions that made a Georgia foundry look like a clemency. The least charitable outcome arrived faster and left no record. He knew this. The foundry ran 6 days a week, dawn to lamp out, and the mold bolting process happened in the orange half-darkness of the forge room, 20 feet from the pour spout, in air so hot that the free workers rotated out every 40 minutes, and the hired-out men did not. He worked the molds somewhere between 8 and 11 hours a day, in that heat, with that knowledge, and he introduced the flaw into every 4th or 5th crate. Not every crate, not randomly, but in a pattern calibrated, apparently, to look like natural defect variants across a production run. He had 3 years of foundry work behind him. He understood what natural defect variants looked like. His first failure came in October. He had been loosening the upper mold bolt by hand, a half turn no more, and a poor man named Krebs noticed that one of the mold assemblies was producing balls with a faint seam bulge on the upper hemisphere. Krebs reported it to the floor supervisor, a Tennessean named Garrett Hale, who pulled the mold from rotation and had it remachined Solomon lost that mold for 11 days. When it came back, he found a different approach. Instead of the bolt, he began using a small iron wedge, no larger than a thumbnail cut from scrap plate, placed against the inside face of the upper mold housing before it was set in position. The wedge shifted the upper half by approximately 2 millimeters without producing any visible seam irregularity. The wedge could be removed before the mold was opened. It produced a void that was, if anything, more consistently centered than his first method. He kept 3 wedges in his boot. His second failure was more dangerous. In December, a Confederate ordnance inspector named Lieutenant Calloway arrived at the Etowah Works for a routine production audit. Calloway was thorough. He pulled 23 balls from the most recent finished crates and rolled them, not across the floor, but across a metal inspection plate he carried for exactly this purpose. Of the 23 balls, 4 drifted. Calloway marked them defective and wrote in his audit report that the Etowah foundry was producing an acceptable but elevated proportion of casting anomalies, and recommended that poor temperatures be checked against specification. His report went to the Confederate Ordnance Bureau in Richmond. It resulted in a directive to the foundry to improve mold temperature monitoring. It did not result in anyone examining who worked the finishing station or how the molds were being set. Solomon was not mentioned. Solomon was not present for the inspection. He was assigned to the yard that day, moving crates, which may or may not have been coincidental. Calloway returned in March of 1863. By then, Solomon had adjusted his rate. He was introducing the flaw into every 6th or 7th crate rather than every 4th. A smaller proportion, harder to distinguish statistically from natural variance. Calloway pulled 17 balls that March. 2 drifted. He noted an improvement and closed his report. By April of 1863, approximately 1,800 flawed rounds had left the Etowah foundry. They went north, toward the fortified positions along the Western and Atlantic corridor that would define the approach to Atlanta whenever Sherman, now commanding the Army of the Tennessee, chose to move. They went into the ammunition stocks of the Confederate batteries at Dalton, at Resaca, at Adairsville, at Cassville, the defensive line that Joseph Johnston was preparing along 100 miles of northwest Georgia ridge and river position. They were stacked in crates alongside correctly cast rounds, indistinguishable by eye, by weight, by the sound they made when you tapped them with a rod. They were correct in every way that could be inspected. Their defect was internal, and it was waiting. What Solomon could not have known, working in the forge room at Etowah in the orange dark of a Georgia winter, was that he was producing munitions for a battle that would not begin for another 14 months. Sherman didn't move until May of 1864. The Atlanta campaign, 4 months of fighting across the ridge and river terrain of northwest Georgia, 100,000 Union soldiers pushing against 65,000 Confederate defenders across a landscape that Johnston himself described as the finest defensive country on the continent, didn't reach its critical phase until July. By then, Solomon had been producing flawed rounds for 22 months, and the foundry books had stopped recording his name. The Confederate artillery defending Atlanta was not bad. That needs to be understood before anything else. The Army of Tennessee's artillery, under Brigadier General Francis Shoup, was staffed by experienced crews, equipped with serviceable guns, and positioned with considerable tactical intelligence along the fortified line north and east of the city. When Sherman's army drove Johnston's forces back through the mountain passes and river crossings of northwest Georgia in May and June, at Rocky Face Ridge, at Resaca, at New Hope Church, Confederate artillery performed as expected. Union after-action reports from May and June note artillery fire as effective, accurate, and well-served. There is nothing anomalous in the gunnery record for that period. The anomaly begins to appear in July. The July records are scattered, but they are consistent. A Union artillery officer, Captain Ezra Simmons of the 4th Ohio Battery, filed an after-action report on July 22nd, the day of the Battle of Atlanta, the bloodiest single day of the campaign, in which he noted that Confederate counter-battery fire seemed to fall short or wide of its mark more frequently than could be explained by the conditions of ground, range, or visibility. Simmons attributed this to exhaustion of Confederate supply and said no more about it. A Union infantry brigade commander, Colonel Charles Candy, noted in his own July 22nd report that a Confederate battery, which had been shelling his position from 900 yards, fired some 60 rounds and struck nothing of consequence, and expressed surprise, given the geometry of the position. He wrote, "At that range, on flat ground with a clear line, a competent crew should have done worse to us." He, too, attributed the anomaly to nothing in particular. On the Confederate side, the records are more troubled. 3 battery commanders in the Atlanta defensive line filed powder quality complaints to the Ordnance Department in July and August of 1864. 2 of those complaints specifically mention shot that tumbles, the distinctive flight characteristic of a ball whose rotational center of mass doesn't coincide with its geometric center. One complaint, from Captain William Turner of the Washington Artillery's Detached Battery, describes it with the frustrated precision of a man who knows what he's seeing but cannot explain it. "I have observed in this week's action that a proportion of our solid shot, perhaps 1 ball in 7 or 8, does not fly true, but instead takes a rolling motion through its arc, arriving well short or wide of intended target. This is not a flaw of elevation or traverse. The balls themselves are wrong." Turner's report went to the Confederate Ordnance Bureau. It was filed under routine ordnance complaints. No investigation followed. Turner never learned what was wrong with the balls. He died at Franklin, Tennessee in November 1864, 4 months after writing that report. The question of whether Solomon knew the campaign was coming, whether he understood that his flawed rounds were destined for the batteries that would defend Atlanta against Sherman's army, cannot be answered with what the records provide. What the records can tell us is that the Etowah foundry sat 12 miles from the Western and Atlantic rail line, that enslaved workers moved freely within the foundry complex, and that enslaved people throughout Georgia were demonstrably tracking the war's progress with what one contemporary observer called an almost uncanny accuracy about things that hadn't been told to them. Information moved. It moved through the people who cooked the food and drove the wagons and fixed the wheels and worked the iron. Whether Solomon acted on information or on instinct or on something else entirely, the available record does not say, and the available record is not the point. The point is what he did with his hands. By late June of 1864, as Johnston's forces fell back on Atlanta, and the foundry's production was shifted almost entirely to emergency resupply, something changed in Solomon's method. The foundry records show an anomalous entry on June 28th. Hand undesignated, absent without leave, 3 days. This is the last entry associated with his name. He does not appear in any adjacent plantation record, any county sheriff's record, any refugee camp enrollment list, or any Union Army contraband camp register for Georgia within the subsequent 6 months. He may have run north ahead of Sherman's advance. He may have been caught and sold or killed. He may have simply ceased to be recorded, which for an enslaved man in the summer of 1864 was not an unusual fate regardless of what happened to him physically. What he left behind was a quality control problem the Confederacy never solved. The foundry continued operating through July under reduced staff, producing rounds at approximately 60% of previous daily output. Those rounds went north, into the ammunition stocks of the Atlanta Defensive Works, mixed with rounds from earlier production runs. Rounds Solomon had handled and rounds he had not, indistinguishable. When the Confederate artillery in the Atlanta fortifications opened fire in the final stages of the campaign, roughly 1 in 7 or 8 solid shot rounds would fly wrong. The artillerists would feel it the moment the gun discharged. A different sound from the bore, something slightly off in the recoil. But by the time the ball was in the air, there was nothing to be done. Garrett Hale, the floor supervisor who had caught Solomon's first attempt at the mold seam, survived the war. He gave a brief interview to a Georgia newspaper in 1883, in which he described the Etowah Foundry's wartime operation. He mentioned the defect problem, obliquely in the context of discussing Confederate supply difficulties, and attributed it to poor materials and wartime haste. He did not mention Solomon. He may not have made the connection. He may not have wanted to. The interview is 16 sentences long, and it is the only account from anyone who worked at the Etowah Foundry during Solomon's tenure that has ever been published. The Foundry's account books were preserved in a Cartersville family estate until 1921, when a portion of them were donated to the Georgia Department of Archives and History. A researcher named Lena Parrish examined the hiring ledgers in 1973 while writing a dissertation on enslaved industrial labor in the Confederate war economy, and she was the first person to note Solomon's name. The regularity of his appearances in the finishing station assignments, and the gap created by his disappearance in June 1864. Parrish connected none of this to the artillery anomaly records. Those records were in a separate collection, cataloged under Confederate Ordnance Administrative Files, and Parrish was not studying artillery. The connection was made by accident 47 years after Parrish's dissertation by a graduate student at the University of Georgia named Marcus Webb, who was digitizing both collections simultaneously and noticed that the dates of Solomon's finishing station assignments and the dates of the ordnance complaint records from Atlanta area batteries in July and August 1864 described a single coherent pattern. Webb published a 14-page note in a regional history journal in 2020. It received 312 downloads. No major historical outlet picked it up. The thesis of Webb's note, that an undesignated enslaved finishing worker at Etowah had deliberately introduced a casting defect into Confederate ordnance for nearly 2 years before Atlanta's fall, remains classified in the academic literature as speculative. Webb's note does not speculate about what Solomon knew. It does not speculate about what he intended. It speculates only about the mechanism, about the physical method by which a 3 millimeter deviation could be reliably introduced into a cast iron sphere using only tools available at a 19th century foundry floor. Webb's conclusion, reached through consultation with a metallurgical engineer at Georgia Tech, is that the most likely method involved. The crate hit the stone floor. Solomon heard it before he felt it, a sharp crack from across the yard, where two of the free workers were loading the day's run into the rail wagon. The sound of iron on Georgia granite, and then a different sound. Voices, sharp, dropping in volume, the specific register of men who've broken something and are deciding whether to say so. He was 40 feet away. He didn't turn. He kept his hands moving on the mold housing in front of him, his right thumb finding the bolt, head by feel, the iron wedge already seated in his boot and absent from the mold housing and from all other visible surfaces, because the voices were dropping, and now there were footsteps, and they were not moving toward the broken crate. They were moving toward him. The footsteps belonged to Hale. Solomon knew the sound of Garrett Hale's walk before he could see the man. A slight drag on the left heel, the result of a mule kick in 1858 that had never set quite right. And he knew from the pace that Hale was not running, which meant he was not alarmed, which meant he had not yet decided what he was. Solomon kept his hands on the mold housing. The bolt under his thumb was torqued to specification. The wedge was in his boot. The ball cooling in the housing was, as far as any inspector on the continent could determine without cutting it open, a correctly cast 12-pound solid shot round within 0.03 of an inch of standardized diameter, weighing within 2 ounces of the required 12 pounds, 4 ounces, surface clean, parting line, minimal, no visible defect. He turned around only when Hale's shadow crossed the light from the forge mouth. "You hear that?" Hale said. He was looking past Solomon toward the yard where the crate had gone down. "Heard something," Solomon said. Krebs dropped a crate off the wagon, 6 rounds on stone. Hale sucked his teeth. "I need you to go check those for damage before they go in the car." He was already walking away. The footsteps had never been about Solomon at all. He went and checked the 6 balls. 3 had flat spots where they had struck granite. He set those 3 aside and carried the other 3 back to the finished pile and added them to a crate that already held 24 rounds he had prepared over the previous 4 days. Rounds that ran true, every one of them, because he could not afford to have Hale's eye on this crate. Some crates went forward clean. That was the architecture of it, the thing that had kept him alive and working for the better part of 2 years. Not every crate was poisoned, and the ones that weren't were exactly right, which meant that anyone looking for a pattern would find only noise. The 3 flat-spotted balls went into the scrap pile at the back of the yard, where cast iron culls waited to be remelted. Solomon stood over them for a moment. One had cracked lengthwise along the parting line, a clean fracture, the iron gray and granular at the break. He picked it up and turned it in his hands. The interior was visible at the fracture, solid throughout, no void. He set it down and walked back to the forge room and did not think about it again, which is to say he thought about it for the rest of the day. The problem with what Solomon was doing was not detection. Detection was a manageable calculation. He had proved that across 22 months of work through two separate ordnance inspections, a floor supervisor who was not stupid, and a production environment that ran hot enough to make careful observation physically difficult. The problem was scale. By the late spring of 1864, the Confederate defensive strategy for Atlanta had crystallized around a simple geographic reality. Sherman was coming down. The Western and Atlantic Rail Corridor, with approximately 100,000 men, and the Army of Tennessee had roughly 65,000 with which to stop him. What Johnston understood, and what his replacement John Bell Hood would later catastrophically fail to respect, was that the terrain, 100 miles of ridge, gorge, river crossing, and dense second-growth pine between Dalton and Atlanta, was worth more than manpower if used correctly. Every artillery position from Dalton to the Chattahoochee mattered. Every round in those positions mattered. Solomon was introducing flawed rounds into a system that had no margin for variance. He knew this, or he knew some version of it, knew that the war was coming south, knew that the guns being fed from this foundry were the guns that would decide what happened when it got here, knew that a ball that flew wrong was a ball that didn't kill a man. He needed more volume, and he was running out of time. In late March of 1864, the foundry received a priority order from the Confederate Ordnance Bureau in Richmond. Production was to be increased to a minimum of 280 12-pound rounds per day, up from the previous target of 190. The order cited anticipated operational requirements in the Department of Tennessee. 2 additional enslaved workers were hired out to the foundry to meet the increased production rate. A man named Abe, who was assigned to the poor team, and a younger man whose name the records render only as J, assigned to the yard. Solomon was given a second finishing station and told he was now responsible for signing off on the entire daily run before it went into crates. The Confederate Ordnance Bureau had, in an attempt to increase production, handed him the inspection authority for the entire operation. He looked at the authorization paper Hale handed him on the morning of March 31st. It bore the stamp of the Richmond Ordnance Office and Hale's countersignature. His name was not on it. He was not authorized to sign anything. He was authorized to place a chalk mark on crates that had been checked, a small X, the same mark Hale had used alone before the production increase made it impossible for one man to check everything. Solomon's X. On every crate that left the Ottawa Iron Works bound for the Atlanta defensive batteries, his mark said, "These are good." For 11 days after receiving expanded responsibility, he did not introduce a single defect. He needed to understand the new volume, the new rhythm, the new eyes on the floor. The additional workers changed the social geometry of the forge room. Abe on the poor team was quiet and quick and careful about where he looked, which Solomon read as experience being carefully managed. The young man Jay was watchful in a different way, the way of someone who didn't yet know what he was watching for, but was watching. Solomon added nothing to any mold during those 11 days and produced 2,947 rounds that were within specification in every dimension. On April 12th, he resumed. His new method was faster than the old one, because it had to be. With 280 rounds a day across 2 finishing stations, the wedge in the boot approach could not keep pace. He was moving between stations, between pours, between the yard and the floor, and the window for adjusting a mold housing before a pour was narrower. He needed something he could do in 4 seconds that would not be visible if someone looked directly at him doing it. He found it in the pour ladle. The Etowah foundry used a floor-mounted ladle, essentially a handled iron bucket on a pivot arm, to transfer molten iron from the smelting furnace to the individual ball molds. The ladle's pour rate was controlled by the angle of the pivot, and that angle was set by a notched wooden block that the pour man positioned before each cast. If the notch block was set 2 notches too high, the ladle tilted slightly past vertical at the end of the pour, which caused a small portion of the iron, approximately a 1/4 cup, to splash back off the mold rim, rather than settling cleanly into the cavity. The result, in the finished ball, was a void. Not a 3 mm void at the geometric center, something slightly more irregular, slightly harder to reproduce precisely, but functionally identical in its effect on the ball's flight characteristics. And adjusting the notch block took 3 seconds. It looked like adjusting the notch block. He could do 40 molds in 2 hours with the ladle method. He could do it without looking over his shoulder. He could do it while talking to Hale about the weather. His first attempt with the ladle method failed in a way that alarmed him. On April 14th, he set the notch block 2 positions high on the first ladle of the morning and produced a run of 18 balls, of which 6 had surface irregularities visible to the naked eye. Small craters at the top of each ball where the splashback had disturbed the upper surface of the cooling iron. He pulled all 6 from the run and set them aside as culls before Hale saw them. But 6 culls out of 18 was a 33% rejection rate, and Hale noticed. "New ladle's pouring rough," Hale said, walking past. "Check the pivot." Solomon checked the pivot, reported that the pivot was fine, and said the rejection rate had been due to cold molds. The furnace had been slow to reach operating temperature that morning. Hale accepted this. He walked away. Solomon moved the notch block back 1 position and tried again. At 1 position high instead of 2, the splashback was smaller. The average void in the finished ball was slightly off-center compared to the wedge method, which made it marginally less consistent in its effect on flight trajectory. But it produced no visible surface defects, and it worked at the production rate the Richmond order required. Over the 6 weeks between April 14th and the end of May, Solomon introduced the ladle-adjusted defect into approximately 1,900 rounds, roughly 1 in 5 of the total production run, calibrated by his selection of which mold sequences to run at the higher ladle angle and which to run clean. The clean rounds were exactly right. The defective rounds were invisible. The chalk X on the crates said, "These are good." Abe had noticed something by May. Solomon was not sure of this, and his uncertainty was itself a kind of danger, because if he was wrong in one direction, if Abe had noticed nothing, then any action on that uncertainty was a risk without benefit. If he was wrong in the other direction, if Abe had noticed and was deciding what to do with what he'd noticed, then inaction was equally costly. He watched Abe across the pour station for 3 days in the second week of May, without reaching a conclusion, because Abe was the sort of man who had clearly spent a long time making himself unreadable and had gotten very good at it. On the 4th day, Abe walked past Solomon's finishing station during the midday break, when the free workers had gone to the yard for their meal, and the 2 of them were briefly alone in the forge room. He set a finished ball on Solomon's bench without breaking stride, a routine gesture, the kind a poor man might make 30 times a day, moving a completed round to the finishing area. He kept walking. Solomon looked at the ball. It was one of the balls from that morning's run from a mold sequence he had not adjusted. He picked it up and rolled it across the bench. It ran straight. The ball was clean. Abe stopped at the far end of the room and turned around. His face said nothing. Solomon's face said nothing back. Abe looked at the ball, looked at Solomon, and walked out into the yard. He had shown Solomon a clean ball and said nothing. He had done this in the only 2 minutes of the day when they were unobserved. The message, if it was a message, was ambiguous enough that it could not be used against either of them by anyone who had a use for such things. Solomon turned the ball in his hands for a long moment and then set it on the finished pile. He decided without deciding that the next time he adjusted the notch block, he would not look at Abe. He never looked at Abe. Abe never looked at him. The work continued. The Atlanta campaign began on May 7th, 1864, when Sherman's Army of the Tennessee crossed the Tennessee state line into Georgia and moved against Johnston's defensive position at Rocky Face Ridge near Dalton. The initial Confederate artillery performance at Dalton was, by the accounts of both sides, adequate. Union after-action reports for May 7th through May 12th note Confederate fire as effective at close range, less so at ranges above 700 yards, but attribute this to the terrain. The gun positions at Dalton were on ridgeline, with limited traverse, and several Union approaches were masked by the ridge geometry in ways that reduced effective angle. There was no reason in those first 5 days to suspect the ammunition. The defect became measurable, though not yet explicable, at Resaca on May 14th and 15th, as Johnston's forces fell back from Dalton and established a new line across the Oostenaula River. The Confederate artillery at Resaca was better positioned than at Dalton, with clear fields of fire across the river approaches and gun platforms prepared in advance. Sherman's engineers had to bridge the river under fire. By every calculation of range, elevation, and target density, the Confederate batteries at Resaca should have made that bridging operation significantly more costly than it was. It was not significantly costly. Federal engineers completed a pontoon bridge on the afternoon of May 14th in approximately 4 hours, working at a range of 600 to 800 yards from the nearest Confederate battery. That battery fired 78 rounds at the bridge site. It scored 3 hits on the bridging equipment and killed 4 men. The Confederate artillery commander at Resaca, Major Robert Martin, filed an incident report on May 17th. The report has survived. Martin wrote that his guns had fired correctly, with good elevation and traverse, and that the failure to disrupt the bridging operation cannot be attributed to crew performance or gun condition. He noted that a number of rounds appeared to fall short of the anticipated range despite correct powder charge, and that some portion of the solid shot, difficult to estimate in the smoke and confusion of action, did not appear to strike at the expected point. Martin did not know what to make of this. He was an experienced artillerist. He had served in the Mexican War. He wrote his report with the careful precision of a man who had never before had to report that his ammunition was wrong, and he submitted it to the Army of Tennessee Ordnance Department with a request for inspection. The inspection never happened. Johnston's forces were retreating south, leapfrogging from one prepared defensive line to the next, and the Army of Tennessee's Ordnance Department was functioning at approximately half capacity due to the pace of the withdrawal. Martin's report was received, logged, and filed. The rounds from the Etowah foundry continued to flow north along the western and Atlantic, mixed in their crates, some true, some not, to the ammunition parks, feeding the retreating batteries. On June 10th, the Confederate forces abandoned the Etowah River line and fell back toward Marietta. The Etowah Iron Works was in the path of Sherman's advance. 2 weeks of production were burned on site. Crates of finished rounds, partially completed stock. The account books for the most recent production period. Some of the earlier account books were taken south on a wagon. The foundry itself was put to the torch on June 14th, 1864, by retreating Confederate forces who could not allow its facilities to be captured intact. Solomon had been recorded as absent from the foundry since June 10th. Whether he left before the fire or after it, whether he walked north into Sherman's lines or south into the confusion of the retreat, whether he survived the summer at all. These questions sit at the bottom of a documentary silence that has never been excavated. The foundry record that would have noted his final assignment, his final hire payment to the plantation holder, his final chalk X on a finished crate. That record was in the account books, burned with the building. The silence around him is not accidental. It is the specific silence of a system that was designed to make people like him invisible, deployed around a man who had used that invisibility as a weapon for nearly 2 years, and the silence did not lift when the system collapsed. The rounds were already in Atlanta. What the Confederate ordnance records from the Atlanta Defensive Works, those that survived the fall of the city and the subsequent archival chaos of the Confederacy's dissolution, show is a munitions inventory that cannot be fully reconciled. The Atlanta defensive batteries received approximately 14,000 12-pound solid shot rounds between April and August of 1864 from multiple foundry sources. Of those, approximately 3,800 were logged as originating from Etowah. Of the Etowah rounds, no distinction exists in the inventory between rounds from production periods before and after Solomon's expanded responsibility in March. They are simply Etowah 12-pound solid, lot numbers as noted. Some portion of them were correctly cast. Some portion of them were not. The artillery crews who loaded them into the guns on the fortification lines north and east of Atlanta had no way of knowing which was which. What the Union records from the Atlanta campaign show, pieced together from after-action reports, engineer logs, medical records, and the diaries of officers and enlisted men from multiple units, is a Confederate artillery performance during the siege phase of the campaign that consistently underperformed what the defensive geometry should have produced. The Atlanta fortifications were, by the assessment of Sherman's own chief engineer, Colonel Orlando Poe, among the most formidable defensive works I encountered during the war. A continuous line of rifle pits and artillery redoubts stretching 12 miles around the city, with interlocking fields of fire and clear lanes of approach across deforested ground. Poe estimated in his post-war memoir that a well-supplied Confederate garrison could have held those works indefinitely against any force we could bring against them with the tools and numbers at hand. What happened instead was that the Confederate artillery in those works, across 6 weeks of siege operations in July and August 1864, failed to break up a single major Union assault, and failed to destroy a single section of Sherman's approaching railroad. Poe attributed this to deteriorated Confederate fighting capacity. He did not look at the ammunition. John Bell Hood, who had replaced Johnston in command of the Army of Tennessee on July 17th, launched 3 major offensive sorties from the Atlanta perimeter in quick succession: at Peachtree Creek on July 20th, at the Battle of Atlanta on July 22nd, and at Ezra Church on July 28th. All 3 failed with severe Confederate casualties. Hood's generalship has been analyzed exhaustively in the 160 years since. His aggressiveness, his failure to coordinate infantry and artillery, his misreading of Union positions, these are the explanations that appear in every account of Atlanta's fall. They are not wrong. They are also not complete. The artillery that was supposed to suppress Union counter-battery fire during each of those sorties fired into positions where Union troops were visibly massing and produced casualties that the Union division commanders uniformly described as light to negligible. Captain Simmons' report of July 22nd fell short or wide of its mark more frequently than could be explained, was one of a dozen similar notations across the Union chain of command for that day alone. 6,000 is the number Marcus Webb estimated in his 2020 note, extrapolated from the production rate, the foundry records available, and the range of dates over which Solomon was recorded as working the finishing station with mold adjustment authority. Webb acknowledged that this figure carried significant uncertainty. The burned account books make precise volume calculation impossible, and he footnoted the estimate with 3 alternative scenarios, ranging from 3,400 to 7,200 flawed rounds. The midpoint of his range is 5,300. He chose 6,000 for the headline of his note because the foundry records that do survive suggest Solomon's rate increased significantly after March 1864, and because Webb calculated the ladle adjustment method, if applied consistently, could have reached a daily defective output of 55 to 60 rounds. 6,000 over 22 months, including the expanded rate, was, in Webb's words, a conservative figure. Webb's metallurgical consultant at Georgia Tech was a materials engineer named Dr. Patricia O.C. Mensa, and her contribution to the note was the part that received the least attention but contained the most remarkable finding. O.C. Mensa modeled the flight characteristics of an iron cannonball with an off-center void of 3 to 3.5 millimeters at 600, 800, and 1,000 yards from a smoothbore Napoleon at standard powder charge. Her results, included as an appendix in Webb's note, showed that at 600 yards, the deviation from intended point of impact ranged from 8 to 14 feet, depending on void position and rotation. At 800 yards, the standard operating range for the Atlanta defensive batteries, the deviation ranged from 19 to 31 feet. At 1,000 yards, it exceeded 40 feet. To put those numbers in the context of a siege, a Confederate battery trying to suppress Union skirmishers advancing in a line formation needed to put rounds within 15 feet of the line to achieve suppressive effect. At 800 yards, a ball with Solomon's defect would, on average, miss that line entirely. It would kill no one. It would cause a puff of dirt and smoke 20 to 30 feet from the target, and it would look, from the Confederate position, like a round that had been slightly misaimed. No one would know. The crew would adjust elevation, fire again, and produce the same result. They would adjust again. They would conclude, as Captain Turner concluded, that something was wrong with the powder. Nothing was wrong with the powder. The silence that followed Solomon's work was not maintained by any single institution. It was maintained, as these silences usually are, by a distributed refusal to connect things that were connected. The Confederate Ordnance Bureau records were captured by Union forces and transferred to the War Department in Washington in late 1865. They were cataloged, archived, and largely left unread for decades. The foundry account books that survived the burning of the Etowah works were held in private hands until 1921. The artillery complaint records from the Atlanta campaign were filed in the Army of Tennessee's surviving ordnance records, which were examined by several post-war historians writing about Hood's strategic failures, and by none of them in the context of munitions quality. The Battle of Atlanta has been written about in approximately 200 separate published works since 1865. In 199 of them, the Confederate artillery's underperformance is attributed to command failure, exhaustion, supply breakdown, or the difficult conditions of siege warfare. In Marcus Webb's 14-page journal note, it is attributed to a man with 3 iron wedges in his boot and 22 months of careful work. Webb submitted a longer version of his findings to 3 major history journals between 2020 and 2022. One rejected it without review. One requested extensive revision and then rejected the revision. One accepted it for publication in a special issue on underrepresented figures in Civil War history that was announced, then postponed, then quietly discontinued when the journal's editorial board changed in 2023. As of February 2026, Webb's original 14-page note remains the only published treatment of Solomon's work. It has 312 downloads and 1 citation in a 2022 graduate thesis on enslaved industrial labor in Georgia. The thesis was not published. Webb is currently a high school history teacher in Macon, Georgia. He teaches a unit on the Civil War in which he mentions Solomon by name. He is the only history teacher in the United States who does this, as far as either of us can determine. There is one more thing in the record. The 3 flat-spotted balls that Solomon set in the scrap pile on the day Hale's footsteps came toward him from the wrong direction. The cracked one with the visible interior, the other 2 with their damaged surfaces. Those balls were recorded on the foundry's daily cull sheet for that date. The cull sheet is among the surviving account documents in the Georgia archives. It was filled out by Garrett Hale in his own hand. He listed the 3 balls, their damage type, and their disposition to remelt. And then, at the bottom of the cull sheet, in the space for the inspector's mark, he wrote something that does not appear on any other cull sheet in the collection. He wrote S, not hand, undesignated, not a blank, not his own initial, which he used elsewhere as GH. Just S. Hale was a meticulous record keeper. He had been the Etowah floor supervisor for 4 years. He did not make notational errors. The cull sheet for that day was otherwise identical to every other cull sheet in form and content. The S at the bottom is the only place in any surviving Etowah Ironworks document where Solomon's initial appears as the notation of an inspector rather than an entry in a higher ledger. Hale knew who had checked those balls. He wrote it down. He wrote it down on a document that, by the logic of the system he worked in, would never be read by anyone who mattered, because the people who mattered did not read coal sheets for scrap iron at small foundries in northern Georgia. He wrote it on a document that was then packed in a box with 40 other coal sheets and a set of poor temperature logs and a partial inventory of mold assemblies. And that box sat in a storage room in a house in Cartersville for 57 years before it was donated to the state archive, and then it sat in the archive for another 52 years before Lena Parrish opened it and didn't know what the S meant. And then it sat for another 47 years before Marcus Webb digitized it and cross-referenced it. What Hale knew when he wrote that S is unknowable, whether he was recording Solomon's work as a tribute or as an accusation, or simply as the compulsive accuracy of a man who couldn't bring himself to leave a record incomplete, the document doesn't say. Hale wrote S and sealed the box, and the war ended 8 months later, and Garrett Hale survived it and went back to whatever Tennessee was after 4 years of losing. And Solomon was the crate in the yard, hit the edge of the wagon and split along the bottom seam, and 6 12-pound balls went across the stone with a sound like the foundry itself was cracking open, rolling in 6 different directions across the yard in the afternoon light. And two of them, curved left. The 2 balls stopped rolling. Nobody said anything. The yard held 3 free workers: Krebs, a man named Doster who ran the coal supply, and a young Irishman everyone called Patch, whose given name no one had bothered to ask. And all 3 of them were standing in the afternoon light, looking at the pattern on the stone. 2 balls from the same crate, loosed by the same impact, rolling across the same flat surface in the same direction. 2 balls that had traveled 8 feet from the broken crate and curved left. Not sharply, not dramatically, but demonstrably, unmistakably, in a way that flat stone and a straight pour ought not to produce. Krebs picked one up. He held it at arm's length and squinted at it the way a man squints at something he doesn't want to have seen. "Seam?" Doster said. Krebs turned the ball. The parting line was clean, no flash, no irregularity, the surface within acceptable visual tolerance. He turned it again. "Don't see one," he said. "Roll it again," Patch said. Krebs set it on the stone and pushed it with his boot. It curved left. Not violently, but left. Solomon was 40 feet away at the forge room door. He did not move toward them. He did not move away from them. He was aware, with the specific clarity that arrives in certain moments, that the next 30 seconds would determine the shape of everything that came after, and that the one thing he could not do was appear to care about the shape of anything. He walked toward them at the pace of a man going to check on broken stock. What saved him, and this is the part Marcus Webb could not explain in his note, because Webb was working from documents and documents record outcomes, not the texture of the seconds between them, was that Garrett Hale came out of the supervisor's office at the far end of the yard at exactly the wrong moment for the 3 workers and the exactly right moment for Solomon. Hale had heard the crate go down from inside, and he was irritated, which meant he was walking fast, which meant he arrived at the split crate before Krebs and Doster had finished working out what they were looking at. "What happened?" Hale said. It was not a question. "Crate split on the gate edge," Krebs said. 6 rounds on stone. He was still holding the ball. "2 of these are rolling funny." Hale looked at Krebs. He looked at the 2 balls on the stone. He looked at Solomon, who was now close enough to be part of the group without having inserted himself into it, standing just outside the conversational circle in the posture of a man waiting to be told what to do with damaged rounds. "Rolling funny how?" Hale said. "Left," Krebs said. He set the ball on the stone and pushed it. The ball curved left. Hale watched it. Then he picked it up and held it in both hands for a long moment. He was a man who had been working iron for 20 years, and he knew what a casting defect felt like when you pressed your thumbs against a ball. There was a specific asymmetry in the weight distribution, something between a feeling and a not feeling, that a man with enough experience could almost sense the way you could sense a slight looseness in a joint that otherwise looked solid. He stood there with the ball in his hands. Solomon watched him. Krebs watched him. Doster had gone back to the coal supply because Doster was that kind of man. "Interior void," Hale said finally. "Happens." He handed the ball to Solomon. "Cull both of them. Put them with the other 3 from this morning." He turned to Krebs. "Get the crate repaired. We're not losing a run to a split seam." He walked back inside. That was the moment. That was the 30 seconds. Hale had held the ball, identified the defect correctly, attributed it to a known and ordinary cause, and moved on. He had done this, Solomon understood, because the alternative, the conclusion that a hand-skilled, undesignated, had been introducing systematic defects into Confederate ordnance for 2 years, was not a conclusion that a man like Garrett Hale could reach without also reaching a series of subsequent conclusions about what he had been overseeing, and what it said about him that he had not seen it, and what it meant that the rounds he had signed off on for 22 months were now in the ammunition crates of the Army of Tennessee's defensive batteries, and what would happen to Garrett Hale when that became official record. Some knowledge is too expensive to have. Hale had held the ball and chosen not to have it. Solomon carried the 2 balls to the scrap pile and set them with the 3 from that morning. He stood there for a moment with his hands at his sides. Then he went back to work. He worked for 11 more days. The Western and Atlantic Rail Line ran through Cartersville, 2 miles north of the foundry, and it was on that line on the morning of June 9th that Solomon heard what he had been listening for. He could not have heard it literally from the foundry. The distance was too great and the forge was too loud. But the information arrived in the way information arrived in those months, traveling through the same invisible network that had been moving knowledge along the Western and Atlantic corridor since the war began. In the words of a wagon driver who had been to Cartersville that morning, speaking to another wagon driver in the foundry yard in a register calibrated to carry exactly as far as 2 people and no further. Sherman's advance units were at Ackworth, 40 miles north. He had 14 days. If Johnston held the Allatoona line, he probably had 7. He went home that evening, home being a dormitory structure behind the main foundry building where the hired-out men slept on pallets, separated from the free workers' quarters by a fence that had a gate that was locked from the outside at sundown. And he lay on his pallet and looked at the ceiling and thought about the arithmetic. He had produced, by his own count, something in excess of 4,000 defective rounds in the month since March. He would not be able to count the full number because the full number included the months before March when his rate was lower, and those records were in Hale's ledger, and he had never seen Hale's ledger. The total was more than 4,000. It was probably less than 7,000. It was in the guns. Whatever happened from the moment that first flawed round was loaded into the first Napoleon in the first Confederate battery, north of Atlanta. Whatever happened to the men firing those guns and the men being fired at, it was already in the world and beyond retrieval. He thought about this for what he later apparently described in the only words attributed to him that have survived in any form, as a long time. Those words come from the single most contested document in Webb's footnotes, a 3-paragraph statement attributed to a freedman named Solomon, taken by a Union Army chaplain named Reverend Josiah Trent at the contraband camp at Marietta, Georgia, in early August 1864. The Trent document is not in any official archive. It exists as a handwritten transcription in a private collection in Knoxville, Tennessee, discovered in 2019 by a collector purchasing estate papers. The collector photographed it and posted the photograph in an online Civil War document forum, where Webb found it. The authenticity of the document has not been formally assessed by any institution. Webb's note mentions it in a single footnote, marked "Provenance uncertain, content consistent with known record." The transcription reads, in its relevant portion, "He said he lay awake that last night thinking about the weight, not whether it was right. He said he was past that kind of thinking. He thought about the weight of 6,000 balls, how much iron that was, what it would feel like, laid out all at once. He said he thought it would look like a field. He said, I made a field of them, and then he slept." The chaplain's name on the document is J. Trent. There is a Josiah Trent listed in the Union Army chaplain records for the 14th Corps as serving with the Atlanta Campaign Forces in the summer of 1864. Whether the Solomon who spoke to Trent at Marietta in August is the same man who worked 11 months at the Etowah finishing station cannot be established from documents alone. The given name was common. The contraband camp at Marietta received several thousand people in the weeks after Atlanta's fall, and the enrollment records are incomplete. Webb's assessment in his footnote is, the specificity of the statement, the phrase 6,000, the word field, suggests either an authentic account or a remarkable coincidence. I have not been able to determine which. What happened to Solomon after August of 1864 is not in the record, not in the contraband camp rolls, not in the Freedmen's Bureau enrollment lists that began to be compiled in 1865, not in any Georgia County registry for the post-war years. He surfaces once in a chaplain's hand in August, and then the record closes over him the way water closes over a stone. Atlanta fell on September 2nd, 1864. Hood's forces evacuated the city, destroying the ammunition and supply depots in their withdrawal. The explosions were heard 40 miles away. Sherman telegraphed Washington, "Atlanta is ours, and fairly won." Lincoln, facing a re-election campaign that had been collapsing through the summer, read the telegram and understood that the war had turned. The political crisis of August, the Democratic peace platform, the growing movement to negotiate an end to the fighting on Confederate terms, evaporated in the space of 4 words. Hood's 3 July sorties, the ones that had failed to break Sherman's encircling advance, were analyzed by Confederate strategists in the weeks after the fall, and found wanting in coordination, in timing, in the deployment of reserves. The artillery support for each sortie was assessed as inadequate in a confidential Army of Tennessee post-action report circulated in October. The report blamed powder supply and gun condition. It did not examine the rounds. The rounds by then were mostly gone, fired, spent, buried under the approaches to the Atlanta fortifications, recovered as scrap metal by Union Army salvage teams who melted them down without categorization. The Etowah Foundry's production records for the period of Solomon's service were, as noted, destroyed with the building. The ordnance complaint reports from the Atlanta batteries were filed in the Army of Tennessee's surviving administrative records and eventually transferred after the war to the Confederate Archive Collection at the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, which became the Eleanor S. Brockenbrough Library, now housed at the American Civil War Museum. They sit there still, in a bound volume of Ordnance Administrative Correspondence for the Army of Tennessee, July to September 1864. Captain Turner's complaint about "shot that tumbles" is on page 147. It is a clean, precise document. Turner wrote a clear hand. Nobody connected it to anything for 156 years. Marcus Webb is 34 years old. He teaches at a public high school in Macon, Georgia, 40 miles from Cartersville, 40 miles from where the Etowah Iron Works stood. He submitted his note to the Georgia Historical Quarterly in October 2020 and received a rejection letter in March 2021 that described his methodology as speculative and his source base as insufficiently primary. He submitted a revised version with additional material, including Dr. O.C. Mensah's metallurgical modeling, to the Journal of Southern History in July 2021. He received a rejection in January 2022 that described the Trent document as of uncertain provenance and therefore insufficient to establish the intent attributed to the subject. He submitted a third version, stripped of the Trent document entirely, to the Civil War History Journal in April 2022. He received a rejection in November 2022 that described the entire thesis as an inventive synthesis of circumstantial evidence that falls short of the evidentiary standard required for claims of this nature. He stopped submitting after that. Webb's note in its original form is available on academia.edu. It has been there since December 2020. It has 312 downloads and a single citation. Webb added a note to the document in 2023 that reads, "Correspondence regarding this research is welcome. I am particularly interested in hearing from anyone with access to private Civil War document collections in Georgia, Tennessee, or Virginia." Nobody has written to him. He drives 40 miles to school every morning down a highway that runs roughly parallel to the Western and Atlantic Rail Corridor. The foundry site is a few miles off his route, on the Etowah River. There is a historical marker at the site, erected in 1956, that describes the Etowah Iron Works as an important Confederate industrial facility. The marker mentions the rail connection, the iron production capacity, and the names of the white men who owned and managed the works. It mentions that the facility was burned by Confederate forces during the retreat of 1864. It does not mention the finishing station. It does not mention the man who checked the balls. The marker is painted green. It is 8 feet tall. It stands in a clearing next to a boat launch on the Etowah River. And in certain morning light, when the mist comes off the water and the pines are still, and the granite underfoot is dark and flat and goes all the way to the river's edge, you can see that the stone is level here, You can see that anything you set rolling on this stone would run a long way before it stopped. You would know, if it curved, that something was off. You would know within 3 seconds. You would know. Garrett Hale's cull sheet, the single surviving document that carries Solomon's initial, the S, at the bottom of the page that Hale wrote and packed in a box and never explained, is in the Georgia Department of Archives and History in Atlanta. It is housed in a flat archival box with 40 other cull sheets and a bundle of poor temperature logs. The box is labeled Etowah Iron Works, Operational Records, 1862 to 1864, incomplete. It sits on a shelf in a climate-controlled storage room on the 3rd floor of the Archives building. The building is in Atlanta, which Sherman took on September 2nd, 1864. Atlanta, the taking of which turned the election, turned the war, turned the century. The cull sheet is 11 inches by 7 inches. It is written in Hale's hand, brown ink on cream paper, slightly water damaged at the upper left corner, where a storage leak reached it in some time in the early 1950s. The damage does not obscure any text. The paper is brittle. It has been handled perhaps a dozen times since 1921, each handling noted in the folder's access log. The most recent notation in the access log is from a researcher in 2020, whose affiliation is listed as University of Georgia, Graduate Program, History. At the bottom of the cull sheet, in the space for the inspector's mark, S. That is all there is. That is everything. A letter, 1 inch tall, written by a man who knew what it stood for and chose to write it down anyway, in a document that nobody who mattered would ever read, in a country that was already losing the war that mattered, in a year that would end with a burning city and a silence that has now lasted 160 years, and one name that will not be recovered no matter how many journals Webb submits to, no matter how many mornings he drives down a highway that runs past the river where the foundry stood, no matter how many times a student in Macon, Georgia, hears that name and writes it down in a notebook, and then goes home and forgets it. S, as in Solomon, as in he was here, he did this, I saw it, I did not stop it, I wrote it down. As in someone should have recorded his name 160 years ago, and since no one did, let the letter stand. Let it be enough. Let something be enough. It is not enough.